The desert wind howled across the barren landscape of eastern Afghanistan, carrying with it the scent of dust and danger. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison crouched behind a rocky outcrop, his weathered face scanning the valley below through high-powered binoculars. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the terrain, creating a perfect cover for what should have been a routine extraction mission. Morrison had been leading Navy SEAL operations for over 15 years, but something about this mission felt different. The intelligence reports seemed too clean, too perfect. According to the briefing, a high-value target was hiding in a compound just 2 miles ahead. The plan was simple. Get in, capture or eliminate the target, and get out before sunrise. Alpha Team, report. Morrison whispered into his radio, his voice barely audible over the wind. Alpha Leader. We have eyes on the compound. No visible movement. Looks quiet, came the response from Petty Officer First Class David Chen. Positioned on the eastern ridge. Bravo Team. Status? Morrison continued. Bravo in position. South side clear. Ready for your signal? Commander, replied Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, her voice steady despite the tension that filled the air. Morrison studied the compound through his scope. 3 buildings surrounded by a low stone wall, with a single dirt road leading in from the west. It looked exactly as the satellite images had shown, but his gut told him something was wrong. In his years of combat experience, he had learned to trust that feeling. The mission had started 3 days earlier at Bagram Airfield. Morrison and his team of 35 SEALs had been briefed by Colonel Richards, a stern-faced Army officer who spoke in clipped sentences. The target was allegedly Hamid al-Rashid, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks on coalition forces throughout the region. This is time-sensitive intelligence, Colonel Richards had explained, pointing to aerial photographs spread across the briefing table. Al-Rashid is meeting with other commanders to plan a major offensive. We need him taken out before those plans can be executed. The mission parameters were straightforward. Morrison would lead 3 teams of 12 SEALs each, plus himself as overall commander. They would insert via helicopter 20 miles from the target, approach on foot under cover of darkness, and conduct the operation at dawn when the targets would be most vulnerable. What the briefing hadn't mentioned was the unusual communications blackout that would be in effect during the mission. Radio silence, except for emergency traffic, Richards had added almost as an afterthought. This operation is classified at the highest levels. No contact with base, unless absolutely necessary. Okay, now, crouched in the Afghan mountains with his teams in position, Morrison wished he had questioned that order more thoroughly. The lack of communication with command made him feel isolated, cut off from the support network that had kept his teams alive through dozens of previous missions. Commander, I'm seeing some movement in the northern building. Chen's voice crackled through the radio. 2 individuals, possibly armed. Morrison adjusted his position, focusing his binoculars on the area Chen had indicated. Sure enough, 2 figures were visible through a window on the 2nd floor. They appeared to be looking out toward the surrounding hills, as if they were expecting something. All teams, hold position, Morrison ordered. Something doesn't feel right about this. He had good reason to be cautious. The intelligence for this mission had come from a local informant, someone the CIA claimed was highly reliable. But Morrison had seen too many operations go sideways because of bad intelligence or compromised sources. The fact that their target seemed to be actively watching for threats suggested either exceptional paranoia or advance warning of their approach. As Morrison considered his options, a distant rumble filled the air. It was barely audible at first, but growing stronger by the second. He recognized the sound immediately. Helicopters, and not just 1 or 2. This was the distinctive heavy thrum of multiple aircraft approaching fast. All teams, we have incoming aircraft. Morrison spoke into his radio, his voice tight with concern. Could be friendly, could be hostile. Maintain concealment and await orders. The sound grew louder, and Morrison could see dust clouds rising from the valley floor as the helicopters approached. Through his binoculars, he counted them. 6 black helicopters, flying in formation. They weren't displaying any coalition markings that he could see, and they were approaching from the wrong direction for a planned friendly operation. "Commander, those birds aren't on our flight plan," Santos reported, her voice betraying the first hint of worry. "And they're heading straight for the compound." Morrison's blood ran cold as he watched the helicopters circle the compound and begin to land. Armed men poured out of the aircraft, at least 40 or 50 fighters wearing mismatched uniforms and carrying AK-47 rifles. This wasn't a terrorist meeting. It was a trap. The realization hit Morrison like a physical blow. They had been set up. Someone had fed the coalition false intelligence, luring a SEAL team into an area where they could be surrounded and destroyed. The compound wasn't hiding a high-value target. It was bait in an elaborate ambush. "All teams, we are compromised," Morrison transmitted urgently. "This is a hostile trap. Prepare for immediate extraction." But even as he spoke those words, Morrison knew extraction wouldn't be simple. They were positioned in a valley with limited escape routes, and the enemy now had significant numbers and air mobility. The helicopters that had delivered the hostile forces were already taking off again, likely to establish a perimeter around the area. "Commander, we've got movement on all sides," Chen reported, his voice tense. "I count at least 60 hostiles spreading out from the compound. They're moving to surround our position." Morrison quickly assessed their situation. His 35 SEALs were elite warriors, each one worth several times their number in conventional fighters. But they were outnumbered, caught in poor terrain, and facing an enemy that had clearly planned this operation in advance. Worse, the communications blackout meant they couldn't call for immediate backup or close air support. "Alpha Team, fall back to Rally Point Bravo," Morrison ordered, referring to a predetermined fallback position they had identified during mission planning. "Bravo Team, provide covering fire and follow. Charlie Team, you're with me. We'll leapfrog back and establish a defensive perimeter." The SEALs moved with practiced precision, years of training taking over despite the desperate circumstances. Alpha Team bounded back through the rocky terrain, using natural cover to mask their movement. Bravo Team laid down, suppressing fire to keep the advancing enemy forces at bay, their M4 carbines crackling in controlled bursts. Morrison led Charlie Team in a fighting withdrawal, stopping periodically to engage enemy fighters who got too close. The Taliban forces were moving aggressively, clearly confident in their numerical superiority and knowledge of the terrain. "Contact left," shouted Petty Officer Second Class Mike Rodriguez, one of Morrison's most experienced operators. He dropped to one knee and began engaging a group of fighters who had worked their way up a rocky slope to flank the SEAL position. The firefight intensified as more enemy fighters joined the battle. Morrison could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire mixing with the more controlled bursts from his team's weapons. The SEALs were holding their own, but they were being pushed steadily back toward a narrow canyon that would provide temporary shelter, but could easily become a death trap if the enemy surrounded them. "Commander, we've got a problem," Santos called over the radio. "Enemy reinforcements coming in from the south. Looks like another 20 to 30 fighters." Morrison cursed under his breath. The enemy numbers were growing faster than his team could handle them. What had started as a roughly 2-to-1 disadvantage was rapidly becoming something much worse. Rally Point Bravo was a cluster of large boulders at the mouth of a narrow canyon. It offered good defensive positions and multiple escape routes. But Morrison knew it was only a temporary solution. They needed to break contact with the enemy and find a way to call for extraction. "All teams, converge on Rally Point Bravo," Morrison ordered. "We're going to establish a defensive perimeter and attempt to contact command." As his teams moved into position, Morrison tried to raise their command post on the emergency frequency. The radio crackled with static, but no response came through. Either they were being jammed, or the mountainous terrain was blocking their signal. "Sir, I'm not getting anything on any frequency," reported Petty Officer First Class Tommy Walsh, the team's communications specialist. "Could be atmospheric interference, could be jamming. Either way, we're on our own for now." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Morrison's teams were now surrounded by an unknown number of enemy fighters in terrain that favored the defenders. They had limited ammunition, no immediate prospects for resupply, and no way to call for help. "Commander, we need to move," Chen called out. "I can see more vehicles approaching from the main road. This is turning into a major operation." Morrison peered through his binoculars toward the road Chen had indicated. Sure enough, a convoy of pickup trucks was approaching, each one loaded with armed fighters. The dust clouds they kicked up suggested even more vehicles were following behind. The scope of the trap was becoming clear. This wasn't a hastily organized ambush by local fighters. Someone had invested serious resources and planning to lure a SEAL team into this valley. The question was, who had that kind of capability, and why they were willing to risk so much to eliminate a single American Special Operations unit. All teams were moving deeper into the canyon, Morrison decided. It's the only direction they haven't surrounded yet, and the narrow approaches will limit their numerical advantage. The SEALs moved swiftly through the rocky canyon, their boots scrambling over loose stones as they sought better defensive positions. Behind them, the sound of pursuing enemies grew louder. Shouts in Pashto echoed off the canyon walls, mixed with the occasional burst of automatic weapons fire. Morrison called a halt at a bend in the canyon where the walls narrowed significantly. Here, his teams could establish overlapping fields of fire that would make any assault extremely costly for the attackers. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would buy them time to figure out their next move. "Set up defensive positions," Morrison ordered. "Alpha Team takes the high ground on the left. Bravo on the right. Charlie Team, you're with me in the center. Make every shot count. We don't know when we'll get resupply." As his teams took their positions, Morrison tried the radio again. This time, he picked up fragments of distant transmissions, but nothing clear enough to establish communication. The mountains were definitely interfering with their signals, but there might be a way to get a message through if they could reach higher ground. "Walsh, take Rodriguez and climb to that ridge." Morrison pointed to a rocky outcrop about 200 meters up the canyon wall. "See if you can get a signal from up there. If you can reach command, tell them we need immediate extraction and close air support." The two SEALs began their climb while the rest of the team prepared for the inevitable assault. Morrison checked his equipment. 4 magazines remaining for his M4, plus his sidearm with 2 spare magazines. His men were in similar situations. They had enough ammunition for a sustained firefight, but not enough for a prolonged siege. "Contact front!" Alpha Team's spotter called out as the first enemy fighters appeared at the mouth of their defensive position. Morrison could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen different positions as the Taliban fighters began their attack. The canyon erupted in gunfire. The SEALs' disciplined marksmanship took a heavy toll on the attackers, but there seemed to be an endless supply of replacements. For every enemy fighter that fell, 2 more appeared to take his place. "Commander, they're trying to work around our left flank," Santos reported, her voice calm despite the intensity of the firefight. "I can see movement up on that ridge line." Morrison shifted his position to get a better view of the area Santos had indicated. The enemy was indeed trying to outflank them, sending fighters up the steep canyon walls to get above the SEAL positions. If they succeeded, the Americans would be caught in a deadly crossfire with no way out. "Chen, take your team and stop that flanking movement," Morrison ordered. "The rest of us will hold the center." As Alpha Team moved to counter the flanking attempt, Morrison heard Rodriguez's voice on the radio from his position up on the ridge. "Commander, I've got a weak signal to command," Rodriguez reported. "The transmission is broken, but I think I got through. I told them we need immediate assistance." Morrison felt a brief moment of hope, but it was quickly tempered by reality. Even if the message got through, it would take time for help to arrive. They needed to hold out until then, and with their ammunition running low, that was going to be increasingly difficult. The battle raged on as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The SEALs fought with the skill and determination that had made them legends, but the enemy's numerical advantage was beginning to tell. Morrison could see the strain on his men's faces as they realized the gravity of their situation. They were trapped in an Afghan canyon, surrounded by enemies who seemed determined to wipe them out completely. Their ammunition was running low. Their communications were uncertain, and help seemed impossibly far away. But they were Navy SEALs, and they would fight until the last bullet was spent. What Morrison didn't know was that 200 miles away, an A-10 Thunderbolt pilot named Captain Sarah Razor Mackenzie had just heard a fragmentary transmission that would change everything. In a few hours, she would make a decision that would break every rule in the book and put her own career on the line to save 35 American warriors she had never met. The trap had closed around Morrison and his teams, but the story was far from over. Captain Sarah Mackenzie pulled her A-10 Thunderbolt II into a gentle turn over the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, the twin engines of the aircraft humming steadily beneath her. The morning sun glinted off the cockpit canopy as she completed her routine patrol mission, scanning the terrain below for any signs of enemy activity. At 32, Mackenzie had already earned a reputation as one of the most skilled close air support pilots in the Air Force. Her call sign, Razor, came not from any aggressive tendencies, but from her precision in delivering ordnance exactly where ground forces needed it. She had flown over 200 combat missions in Afghanistan and Iraq, saving countless lives with her steady hand and calm demeanor under pressure. Today's mission was supposed to be routine, a 4-hour patrol over a relatively quiet sector, maintaining radio contact with ground controllers and providing overwatch for any coalition forces that might need assistance. Mackenzie preferred the busy missions where she could actively support troops in contact, but she understood that deterrent patrols were equally important. Razor 11, this is Kandahar Control, her radio crackled. Continue current patrol pattern. No reported activity in your sector. Copy, Kandahar Control. Razor 1 continuing patrol. Mackenzie responded, her voice professional and crisp. She was about to begin another sweep of her assigned area when she heard something that made her pause. It was faint, barely audible through the static, but it sounded like a fragmentary transmission on one of the emergency frequencies. Mackenzie adjusted her radio settings, switching to the emergency channel that all aircraft monitored. For a moment, there was only static. Then she heard it again. A broken transmission, with what sounded like a unit designation, and a request for immediate assistance. Bravo. Trapped. Immediate. AIR support. Coordinates. The transmission faded in and out, clearly coming from a station with a weak signal or damaged equipment. Mackenzie frowned. She wasn't aware of any operations in her current area, and the transmission wasn't coming through normal command channels. According to her mission briefing, there were no friendly forces operating in the mountainous region to her northeast. She tried to contact the source of the transmission directly. Station calling for assistance. This is Razor 11. Say again your location and nature of emergency. Only static answered her call. Mackenzie tried several more times, but got no response. The fragmentary transmission had mentioned coordinates, but she hadn't been able to copy them clearly. Still, something about the desperation in that brief message made her reluctant to simply ignore it. Kandahar Control. Razor 11. She called to her command post. I'm picking up fragmentary emergency transmissions from approximately Grid 41 SQB 123456. Request information on any friendly forces in that area. There was a pause before Kandahar Control responded. Razor 11, we show no friendly forces in that grid square. Continue your assigned patrol. Mackenzie stared at her navigation display, studying the area where she thought the transmission had originated. The coordinates put it in a remote valley system about 50 miles from her current position. If there were American forces there, they weren't on any official operation that her controllers knew about. That realization sent a chill down her spine. Special operations forces sometimes conducted classified missions that weren't shared with regular Air Force units. If a SEAL team or Special Forces unit was in trouble in that area, the normal command structure might not even know they existed. Mackenzie made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Instead of continuing her assigned patrol, she banked her A-10 toward the northeast, heading for the area where she thought the transmission had originated. Kandahar Control, Razor 11, is diverting to investigate possible emergency beacon in Grid 41 SQB 123456, she reported, deliberately vague about her true intentions. Negative, Razor 11, came the immediate reply. Return to assigned patrol area. We have no reports of emergencies in that grid. Mackenzie hesitated. Direct orders from air traffic control weren't something to be taken lightly, especially during combat operations. But her training as a close air support pilot had ingrained in her a fundamental principle. When American forces were in trouble, everything else became secondary. Kandahar control. I may have emergency transmissions from that area. Requesting permission to conduct brief reconnaissance. Razor 11, negative. Return to patrol immediately. That is a direct order. Mackenzie gritted her teeth. Something was wrong here. Either there were American forces in trouble that the command structure didn't know about, or there was some kind of communication breakdown that was preventing help from reaching troops who needed it. She thought about the fragmentary transmission she had heard. The voice had sounded desperate, and there had definitely been a request for air support. In her experience, American forces didn't call for air support unless they were in serious trouble. Kandahar control. Razor 1 experiencing intermittent radio difficulties. She transmitted, then immediately switched off her primary radio. It was a lie, but it was the only way she could think of to buy herself time to investigate without being directly ordered to abandon any Americans who might be in danger. She knew she was risking her career, but the alternative of leaving fellow service members to die was unthinkable. Mackenzie pushed her throttles forward, accelerating toward the mountain valley where she believed the transmission had originated. The A-10 wasn't the fastest aircraft in the Air Force inventory, but it was built for exactly this kind of mission, providing close support to ground forces in hostile territory. As she approached the target area, Mackenzie began a systematic search pattern, using her aircraft sensors to scan for any signs of activity. The terrain below was rugged and barren, consisting of rocky peaks and narrow valleys that would provide excellent concealment for both friendly and enemy forces. She had been searching for about 10 minutes when she spotted something that made her heart race: muzzle flashes and smoke rising from a narrow canyon system. Even from her altitude of 15,000 feet, she could see that a significant firefight was taking place below. Mackenzie immediately descended to get a better view of the situation. As she dropped to 5,000 feet, the details became clearer. There were definitely two distinct groups engaged in combat. One group positioned in defensive positions within the canyon, and a much larger force surrounding them. The tactical situation was unmistakable to Mackenzie's experienced eye. A small unit was trapped and surrounded by a much larger enemy force. The defenders were clearly outgunned and outnumbered, fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. She tried once more to establish radio contact with the ground forces. Any station in Canyon, November. This is Razor 11 overhead. Do you require close air support? This time, she got an immediate response. Razor 11. This is Neptune 6. We are 35 friendly personnel, surrounded by approximately 150 hostiles. We are in immediate need of close air support. Grid 41S, QB 157423. Mackenzie felt a surge of both relief and anger. Relief that she had found the trapped Americans in time to help, and anger that they had apparently been written off by the command structure. 35 personnel meant this was probably a special operations unit, which explained why their mission wasn't on the regular coordination boards. Neptune 6, copy your location. Can you mark your position for close air support? Razor 11. We have limited marking capability. Friendlies are in the narrow canyon running east-west. All hostile forces are surrounding us from the north, south, and west approaches. Danger close on all approaches. Mackenzie studied the terrain carefully. A danger-close situation meant the enemy forces were within the minimum safe distance for standard air-to-ground weapons. She would need to be extremely precise to avoid hitting the American forces she was trying to help. The A-10's 30mm GAU-8 cannon was perfect for this kind of work. Unlike bombs or missiles, the cannon could be precisely controlled and would allow her to engage targets very close to friendly forces without the risk of collateral damage from explosive ordnance. Neptune 6. I have 30 mic available for close support. Can you talk me onto targets? Affirmative. Razor 11. Priority targets are approximately 50 meters north of our position. Enemy forces are massing for assault. Mackenzie rolled her A-10 into an attack run, lining up on the area the ground controller had indicated. Through her targeting systems, she could see groups of armed figures moving through the rocks north of the canyon, where the Americans were trapped. Neptune 6, Razor 11 is in hot. 30 seconds. Mackenzie squeezed the trigger on her cannon, and the massive GAU-8 roared to life. The 7-barrel Gatling gun fired depleted uranium rounds at a rate of nearly 4,000 rounds per minute, each projectile capable of penetrating armored vehicles. Against unprotected personnel, the effect was devastating. The cannon fire walked through the enemy positions like an invisible scythe, sending up geysers of dust and rock as the rounds impacted. Mackenzie could see enemy fighters scattering in all directions, their assault completely disrupted by the unexpected air attack. Good effects on target, the ground controller called out. Enemy assault has been broken. Request you engage targets to the south. Mackenzie pulled up from her attack run and began maneuvering for another pass. As she did, her secondary radio crackled to life with an angry transmission from Kandahar Control. Razor 11. Respond immediately. You are not authorized to engage targets in that area. Cease fire and return to base immediately. Mackenzie ignored the transmission. Below her, 35 Americans were fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. She wasn't going to abandon them because of bureaucratic confusion or classified mission parameters that kept different parts of the military from talking to each other. She lined up for another attack run, this time targeting the enemy forces positioned south of the trapped SEALs. The tactical situation was becoming clearer as she observed from above. The enemy had positioned themselves to completely surround the canyon where the Americans were trapped, with the obvious intention of wiping them out completely. Neptune 6, Razor 11 rolling in from the south. 30 seconds. Once again, the A-10's cannon tore through enemy positions, scattering fighters who had been preparing for another assault on the SEAL positions. Mackenzie could see secondary explosions as her rounds found ammunition stockpiles and equipment the enemy had positioned for their attack. Outstanding work, Razor 11, the ground controller called. You've broken up their main assault forces, they're pulling back to regroup. Mackenzie felt a surge of satisfaction, but she knew this was only a temporary reprieve. She had disrupted the enemy attack, but she hadn't eliminated the threat. The enemy still had significant numbers, and they would undoubtedly reposition and try again. Her fuel situation was also becoming a concern. She had been burning fuel rapidly during her high-speed approach to the area and her low-altitude attack runs. At her current consumption rate, she had maybe another hour of flying time before she would be forced to return to base. Neptune 6, what's your extraction plan? Mackenzie asked. I can provide cover, but I don't have unlimited time overhead. Razor 11. We have no extraction plan at this time. Our comms to higher headquarters have been sporadic. We're requesting immediate extraction support. Mackenzie's blood ran cold. The ground forces weren't just trapped, they had been abandoned. Whatever classified operation they had been conducting, it had gone wrong, and the normal support structure wasn't responding to their requests for help. She made another decision that she knew would end her military career. Switching to a frequency she knew was monitored by multiple commands throughout the region, she transmitted a clear emergency call. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Razor 11. I have 35 American personnel surrounded and in immediate danger of being overrun in grid 41 SQB 157423. These personnel require immediate extraction support. Any station with extraction capability, please respond. The response came immediately from multiple sources. Razor 1. This is Bagram Command. Authenticate emergency traffic. Razor 11, this is Kandahar Rescue. Do you have authentication for that emergency? Mackenzie realized she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. She didn't have proper authentication codes for the trapped unit because their mission was classified beyond her access level, but she had seen the situation with her own eyes, and she knew 35 Americans would die if she didn't act. All stations, Razor 11. I have visual confirmation of 35 American personnel, surrounded by approximately 100 hostiles. These personnel are in immediate danger of being overrun and require extraction support immediately. Razor 11, this is Colonel Harrison, Bagram Command. You are not authorized to declare emergencies for unknown units. Return to base immediately for debriefing. Mackenzie looked down at the canyon where muzzle flashes were once again beginning to appear as the enemy regrouped for another attack. She could see that the trapped Americans were in desperate shape, running low on ammunition, and with no prospect of relief through normal channels. "Colonel Harrison, with respect, I have American forces in contact and in immediate danger. I am not abandoning them." She switched back to the frequency she had been using to communicate with the trapped SEALs. "Neptune 6, I've got about 45 minutes of fuel remaining. I'm going to need you to help me make the most of it." "Copy, Razor 11. We've got enemy forces regrouping to the west. Looks like they're bringing up heavier weapons." Mackenzie could see what the ground controller was referring to. Several pickup trucks had appeared on the western approach to the canyon, and she could see crews unloading what looked like mortars or recoilless rifles. If the enemy succeeded in setting up those weapons, they would be able to bombard the trapped Americans from positions that were protected from direct assault. "Neptune 6, I see the heavy weapons. I'm going to take them out before they can get set up." Mackenzie dove toward the western approach, lining up her attack run on the enemy weapons teams. This would be her most dangerous pass yet, as she would be flying directly over enemy positions that would be able to engage her aircraft with small arms fire. The A-10 was built to survive exactly this kind of environment, with titanium armor around the cockpit and redundant flight systems. But Mackenzie knew she was pushing her luck. If she was shot down, not only would she be unable to help the trapped SEALs, but she would become another person who needed rescuing. As she began her attack run, she could see muzzle flashes from the ground as enemy fighters tried to shoot down her aircraft. The distinctive sound of rounds hitting her aircraft reached her ears, but the A-10's armor held. She pressed her attack, walking cannon fire through the enemy positions and destroying the heavy weapons before they could be brought into action. "Great shooting, Razor 11, the ground controller called. "You got them all. That's bought us some time." Mackenzie pulled up from her attack run and checked her fuel gauge. She was down to about 30 minutes of flying time, and she still hadn't figured out how to get the trapped SEALs out of their predicament. She had disrupted the enemy attacks, but she couldn't eliminate all of them, and eventually her fuel would force her to leave. That's when she heard a transmission that would change everything. "Razor 11. This is Dustoff 77. We heard your emergency call, and we're inbound to your location for extraction." Mackenzie felt a surge of hope. Dustoff was the call sign for medical evacuation helicopters, but they could also be used for emergency extractions. If a helicopter crew was willing to risk their lives to pull the SEALs out, there might be a way to save them after all. But as she looked at the tactical situation below, Mackenzie realized that any extraction attempt would be extremely dangerous. The enemy still had significant numbers positioned around the canyon, and a slow-moving helicopter would be extremely vulnerable to ground fire. She was going to have to use every bit of skill and experience she had gained in over 200 combat missions to give the rescue helicopter a fighting chance. The next phase of this operation would determine whether 35 American warriors lived or died, and Captain Sarah Mackenzie was not going to let them down. The voice on the radio belonged to Chief Warrant Officer Mike "Dusty" Collins, a veteran helicopter pilot with over 300 combat rescue missions under his belt. Flying a UA-60 Black Hawk with his crew chief and medic, Collins had been monitoring emergency frequencies when he heard Mackenzie's desperate call for extraction support. "Razor 11, Dustoff 77 is 20 minutes out from your position," Collins transmitted as he pushed his helicopter to maximum speed through the mountain valleys. "What's the landing zone situation?" Mackenzie surveyed the terrain around the trapped SEALs, looking for any area flat enough for a helicopter to land. The canyon where the Americans were positioned was too narrow for a Black Hawk, but there was a relatively flat area about 500 meters to the east that might work. "Dustoff 77, there's a possible LZ 500 meters east of the friendly's position. Grid 41, SQB 162423. But it's going to be hot. Enemy forces are positioned all around the area." "Copy. Understood," Collins replied. "We're going to need you to suppress those positions while we're on the ground." Mackenzie checked her fuel gauge again. She had less than 25 minutes of flying time remaining, which would be cutting it extremely close. She would need to time her attacks perfectly to provide maximum protection for the helicopter during the most vulnerable phases of the rescue operation. Down in the canyon, Lieutenant Commander Morrison heard the radio exchange and felt the first glimmer of hope he had experienced since the trap had been sprung. His teams were down to their last few magazines of ammunition, and several of his men had been wounded by enemy fire. The arrival of air support had disrupted the enemy attacks, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they regrouped and overwhelmed his positions. "All teams, we have extraction inbound," Morrison announced over his radio. "Prepare to move to the eastern LZ on my signal. We're going to have to fight our way out of here." The plan was dangerous but simple. When the rescue helicopter approached the landing zone, Morrison's teams would have to leave their defensive positions and make a fighting withdrawal across 500 meters of open ground while under fire from enemy forces positioned on the surrounding hills. Mackenzie could see the tactical problem clearly from her position overhead. The SEALs would be completely exposed during their movement to the landing zone, and the helicopter would be vulnerable while it was on the ground loading passengers. She would need to keep the enemy forces suppressed during the entire operation, which would require precise timing and every round of ammunition she had left. "Neptune 6. Here's how we're going to do this," Mackenzie transmitted. "I'm going to make attack runs on the north and south ridgelines to suppress enemy positions. When I call execute, you move your teams toward the LZ. I'll provide continuous cover during your movement." "Copy, Razor 1-1. We'll be ready." Mackenzie began her first suppression run, targeting enemy positions on the northern ridgeline that overlooked the route the SEALs would have to take. Her cannon fire raked through the rocky positions, sending enemy fighters diving for cover and disrupting their ability to coordinate fire against the escaping Americans. As she pulled up from her attack run, she could see the Black Hawk helicopter approaching from the east, flying low through the valleys to avoid enemy observation for as long as possible. Collins was pushing his aircraft hard, taking risks that would normally be considered unacceptable to reach the trapped Americans in time. "Dustoff 7-7, I have you in sight," Mackenzie reported. "LZ is clear at this time, but expect heavy ground fire during approach and departure." "Copy, Razor 1-1. We're committed to this landing." Mackenzie rolled into another attack run, this time targeting enemy positions on the southern ridgeline. She could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as enemy fighters tried to engage her aircraft, but the A-10's armor continued to protect her from the small arms fire. As her cannon fire walked through the enemy positions, she called out to the trapped SEALs, "Neptune 6, execute, execute, execute." Morrison's voice came back immediately. "All teams, move, head for the LZ." From her position overhead, Mackenzie could see the SEALs emerging from their canyon positions and beginning their desperate dash across open ground toward the landing zone. They moved in tactical bounds, with one team providing covering fire, while another team moved, then leapfrogging forward in a coordinated withdrawal. But the enemy had been waiting for exactly this moment. As soon as the Americans left their defensive positions, concentrated fire began pouring down from the surrounding hills. Mackenzie could see dust kicking up around the running SEALs as bullets impacted the ground around them. "Taking heavy fire," Morrison reported over the radio. "We've got casualties." Mackenzie immediately dove toward the heaviest concentration of enemy fire, bringing her cannon to bear on a group of fighters who had set up a machine gun position on the northern slope. Her rounds silenced the position, but more enemy fire was already coming from other locations. The Black Hawk helicopter had reached the landing zone and was beginning its approach. But Collins could see the intensity of the ground fire that was being directed at the area. Any helicopter pilot with sense would have aborted the landing, but Collins had not survived 300 combat missions by playing it safe when American lives were at stake. "Dustoff 7-7 is coming in hot," Collins announced as he brought his helicopter into a steep, fast approach that would minimize his time in the most dangerous part of the flight profile. Mackenzie continued her attacks, switching targets rapidly to keep enemy fighters suppressed. She could see that several of the SEALs were wounded and being helped by their teammates, but they were still moving toward the landing zone with the determination and discipline that made them legends. As the Black Hawk flared for landing, enemy fire intensified dramatically. Mackenzie could see tracer rounds passing close to the helicopter as Collins fought to get his aircraft on the ground. The door gunners on the Black Hawk were returning fire, their machine guns adding to the volume of suppressing fire that Mackenzie was providing with her cannon. "LZ is taking heavy fire," Collins reported. but he continued his landing approach. Coming in now! The first group of SEALs reached the landing zone just as the Black Hawk touched down. They immediately began loading wounded personnel into the aircraft while maintaining defensive positions around the helicopter. Mackenzie could see that the loading process was going to take several minutes, during which the helicopter would be a stationary target for every enemy weapon within range. She checked her fuel gauge and her heart sank. She had less than 10 minutes of flying time remaining, and her ammunition counter showed she was down to her last few hundred rounds. If the extraction took much longer, she would be forced to leave before it was complete. Neptune 6, you need to expedite that loading. Mackenzie transmitted urgently. I'm running low on fuel and ammo. Copy. Razor 1-1. We're moving as fast as we can. Morrison was coordinating the extraction with the calm professionalism that had made him one of the Navy's most respected special operations leaders. Despite the chaos around him, he ensured that the most seriously wounded men were loaded first, while his remaining SEALs maintained a defensive perimeter around the helicopter. Mackenzie made another attack run, targeting a group of enemy fighters who were trying to get close enough to the landing zone to use rocket-propelled grenades against the helicopter. Her cannon fire scattered the group, but she could see more enemy fighters moving into position from multiple directions. Razor 1-1. This is Kandahar Control. Her radio crackled with an angry transmission. You are ordered to return to base immediately. Your current actions are unauthorized, and you are putting other aircraft at risk. Mackenzie ignored the transmission completely. Below her, American lives hung in the balance, and she wasn't going to abandon them because of bureaucratic procedures or unauthorized mission parameters. The loading process continued under intense fire. Mackenzie could see that several more SEALs had been wounded during the movement to the landing zone, and the helicopter was becoming dangerously overloaded as Collins's crew tried to fit 35 operators plus their wounded teammates into an aircraft designed for fewer passengers. Dust off. 7-7, you're taking hits, Mackenzie called out as she saw sparks flying from the helicopter's fuselage, where enemy bullets were striking. We're still flying, Collins responded grimly. How much longer for loading? How much longer for loading? 2 more minutes, Morrison reported from the ground. Mackenzie knew she didn't have 2 minutes of ammunition left. Her cannon rounds were nearly exhausted, and her fuel situation was becoming critical. She had maybe 5 minutes of flying time before she would be forced to leave or risk crashing. She made a decision that would later be called either the most heroic or most foolish act of her military career. Instead of conserving her remaining ammunition for 1 or 2 more attack runs, she began a continuous strafing pattern around the landing zone, expending her last rounds in a sustained suppression attack that kept enemy heads down during the final stages of the loading process. Her cannon fell silent just as Morrison called out, "Last man aboard." Dust off. 7-7. You're clear to lift. Collins immediately began pulling the overloaded helicopter into the air, his engines straining with the excessive weight. Enemy fire intensified as the aircraft became airborne, with every enemy fighter in the area trying to bring down the departing helicopter. Mackenzie, now completely out of ammunition, made one last pass over the enemy positions at high speed and low altitude. The psychological effect of the A-10's presence was enough to disrupt the enemy's aim during the critical moments when the helicopter was most vulnerable. Dust off. 7-7 is clear of the LZ, Collins reported, as he accelerated away from the landing zone. All personnel aboard. Mackenzie pulled up from her final pass and watched the Black Hawk disappear into the safety of a distant valley. 35 American warriors who had been facing certain death were now flying to safety, wounded but alive. Her fuel warning light was now flashing red, indicating she had perhaps 3 or 4 minutes of flying time remaining. She turned her A-10 toward the nearest friendly airfield, pushing her engines to maximum efficiency as she tried to cover the distance before her fuel ran out completely. Razor 1-1. This is Bagram Approach Control, her radio crackled. We have you on radar. You are cleared for emergency landing. Runway 3-6. Fire crews are standing by. Mackenzie barely made it. Her engines flamed out just as she crossed the runway threshold, and she dead-sticked the A-10 onto the runway, with the skill that had made her one of the Air Force's most respected pilots. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, she was immediately surrounded by security personnel and fire crews. Colonel Harrison, the Bagram base commander, was waiting for her as she climbed out of her aircraft. His face was grim, and Mackenzie knew her military career was about to come to an abrupt end. "Captain Mackenzie, you are under arrest for disobeying direct orders, engaging unauthorized targets, and conducting unauthorized operations," Harrison announced formally. Mackenzie nodded calmly. She had known this moment would come from the time she made her first unauthorized radio call. "Yes, sir. I understand." As she was escorted to the security office, Mackenzie felt no regret for her actions. She had saved 35 American lives, and that was worth any consequences she might face. What she didn't know was that word of her actions was already spreading throughout the special operations community. The SEALs she had saved were telling their story to anyone who would listen, and senior officers who understood the classified mission parameters were beginning to ask hard questions about why a special operations unit had been abandoned during a classified operation. 3 weeks later, Mackenzie found herself standing before a board of senior officers in the Pentagon. The investigation into her actions had revealed the failures in the command structure that had nearly cost 35 American lives. The classified mission had been compromised from the beginning, but poor communication between different commands had prevented proper support from reaching the trapped SEALs. Instead of the court-martial she had expected, Mackenzie received a letter of reprimand for disobeying orders, along with a Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions in saving the lives of 35 American service members. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, fully recovered from his wounds, was present at the ceremony where Mackenzie received her medal. As he shook her hand, he spoke for all the men she had saved. "Captain, what you did that day was the finest example of American military values I've ever witnessed. We all owe you our lives." Mackenzie smiled as she accepted the thanks of the men she had risked everything to save. She had broken every rule in the book, disobeyed direct orders, and put her entire career on the line. But 35 American warriors had gone home to their families because she chose to do what was right instead of what was officially authorized. In the years that followed, the story of how one A-10 pilot broke all the rules to bring home 385 SEALs would become legend in the special operations community. It would be told in training schools and briefing rooms as an example of the warrior spirit that defines the best of American military service. Mackenzie continued flying A-10 seconds for the remainder of her career, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. She never spoke publicly about the events of that day in the Afghan mountains, but she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes doing the right thing requires breaking the rules. The 35 SEALs she saved went on to complete hundreds of successful missions, their experience and expertise preserved for the battles that lay ahead. Many of them would later say that everything they accomplished after that day was possible only because one Air Force pilot decided that American lives were worth more than following unauthorized orders. In the end, Captain Sarah Razor Mackenzie had proven that the most important rule of all is the one that says you never leave a fellow American behind, no matter what the cost might be to yourself.